Earlier in this series, I did an interview with Captain Signa Oliver about what it was like to be a woman in the armed forces. It was a great interview. If you haven't listened, you should. But it made me realize that Signa's story is only one of about 2 million. It was poignant, powerful, and really opened my eyes. But it wasn't representative. She was an officer. And not just an officer, but a prosecutor. So we wanted to get more stories from women who served in the armed forces. As part of KJZZ's Women in the Community Speaker Series, we invited Captain Oliver and 2 other women veterans back to tell their stories. The first is Joanna Swett. She's a former Marine Staff Sergeant who served in Iraq and Okinawa. The second is Jessica Morell, who served in the Army for 8 years and currently serves as a chaplain in the National Guard. And of course, the third is Captain Oliver. They all joined for different reasons, and they all served at different times in different services and had different roles in the armed forces. But they all served in the military during a time when women weren't as integrated as they are today. Women still couldn't serve in the infantry or on submarines like they can today. Join me and Lauren Gilger, the host of KJZZ's The Show, for a discussion about what it means to not just be a veteran, but to be a woman veteran.
You're listening to Hear Arizona, addressing issues, empowering our community.
And I want to introduce our 3 panelists today. Our first one is Joanna Swett. She is a former staff sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. She served from 1998 to 2007, including tours of duty in Okinawa and Iraq. So welcome to Staff Sergeant veteran Joanna Swett. Our second guest is Signa Oliver. She served in the United States Army back in the 1980s in the artillery. After getting out of the Army, she joined the Phoenix Police Department and then went to law school and then went back into the Army as a Judge Advocate General officer. She worked basically as a prosecutor in court-martial cases. And then our third guest is Jessica Morell. She was a sergeant in the United States Army from 1997 to 2005. She served in Bosnia, Korea, Germany, and Iraq. So welcome to all 3 of you, and thank you all for taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, welcome. What backgrounds. This is, I'm excited to hear everything you have to say. I want to start with a kind of a broad question, but all of you entered the military, it sounds like, when women were, I think it's fair to say, less integrated into the armed forces than they are today. And I want to just begin with a why question. You know, why did each of you take that path? What drew you to the military service? Why don't you begin, Joanna?
Sure, thanks. I grew up a military brat. My dad was in the Air Force, so I lived the military family lifestyle. Nobody ever engaged me about the potential of joining the service, and it was not ever a thought in my brain. I was destined to be the next Mary Tyler Moore, and that was my future, going to the city, but some things changed in my life right after high school. I had a baby, my beautiful daughter, who's now 25, and I was kind of lost here in Arizona. I knew I didn't want to not do anything, which is what everybody kept telling me. It was like, your future is bleak. You're just a mom now. And one day, a friend of mine who I went to high school with, another woman, made the decision to join the Marine Corps. And I had never heard of a Marine coming from the Air Force Army lifestyle. And I went with her to what's called like a DEP pool meeting. And I became quite enamored by the institution of the Marine Corps, its prestige. If you ever see a Marine in their dress blue uniforms, it's just like out of this world. And I was already kind of an alpha personality. I was an athlete in school. And so they knew what to say to me at that time to really perk my interest. And so I found myself going down that pathway quite haphazardly.
Let's hear from you next, Signa. Can you tell us your story a little bit about how you got into military life?
Well, and thank you, Jojo, for your your remarks. She's an amazing woman, by the way. Well, I'm a third generation military person. I am the first woman in my family to serve in the military, and always, had a great respect for those who served. My dad served. I have brothers that served. Grandfather served. So when I was in college, I needed, assistance with going to school. My mother was a nurse, and at the time, I wasn't eligible for any financial aid. So I thought, I can go in the military and, get the education I want, and then, further my career. I always wanted to be an attorney since I was about 8 or 9 years old. I was a judge in a courtroom case in the 3rd or 4th grade. So I had made my decision then. So I had to be educated to do that. So the first time I joined as an enlisted person, and I was a telecommunications specialist, and I had a top secret security clearance, and I was out in a hot rat rig in the middle of nowhere, listening to messages, and I was assigned to a field artillery unit here in Arizona. And that was a different experience for a little, Phoenix City girl. And then as Scott talked about when he was introducing us, so I was a police officer after that, worked for the police department, became an actual police officer for the city of Phoenix. And then at some point in time, I was married with 2 kids. I decided I'm not doing what I set out to do. I want to be, an attorney. So I quit my job and went to law school. And during our 3rd years, when you're, looking for a job, and we were in, I believe, Atlanta, and we were interviewing, and one of my best friends interviewed with the JAG Corps, the Army JAG Corps. And she's like, just interview with them. And I was like, well, I've already done about 6 years. I'm good. And I did actually talk to them. Well, they took me, not her, primarily because I was probably already acclimated, prior military service and a 3rd generation, Army person. So they took me, and it was an amazing experience. I got the opportunity to serve. We went to it's called Fort T. JAGSA, which is the JAG school for all of the armed forces on the campus of the University of Virginia. And I didn't know if anybody else in the Army knew about this, because those were like Air Force quarters, and Army is not used to that. So, and then spent a few months at Fort Lee, and then was shipped off to the home of the infantry, HUA, Fort Benning, Georgia, where half my career I was an administrative and civil law attorney, where I practiced before the EEOC, the Merit System Protection Board, and I was a special assistant U.S. attorney for the Middle District of Georgia. So I was a U.S. attorney representing the United States military. And the other half, I was a prosecutor, as Scott talked about. I prosecuted all kinds of criminal cases. I prosecuted the first HIV case in the United States Army and won, and got the biggest sentence that judge had ever given in his career, and he was retiring. So I had an amazing career. I was afforded amazing opportunities, and I look back at that time and treasure that time. Thank you.
Thanks, wonderful, wonderful. All right, and so turn to you, Jessica, last for your kind of introduction to the military, and then we'll toss it to Scott for some questions after that.
Well, thank you for having me. I was born in a small town here in Arizona, Miami, Arizona, which is about an hour east of the Phoenix area. And I knew there was 2 things that I wanted to do in my life. I knew I wanted to travel, and I knew I wanted to be an elementary school teacher. And I needed help being able to do that. And so a few of my friends had joined right out of high school into the military. And for me, it was just an opportunity to take advantage of the educational benefits as well as the opportunity to travel. And within the first year of joining the Army, I was deployed to Bosnia. So I was on my way right away, being able to see other parts of the world.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Okay, so we want to talk next about, which I think logically makes sense, talk about training, right? Scott tells me that training changes you. And I'm going to toss this to him. I want to hear a little bit about your own experience in this, Scott, because you're also a veteran. And then we can hear from some of our panelists as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, so everybody who joins the military goes through training. They call it indoctrination because they are taking somebody who is a complete civilian and turning them into somebody who is ready to be in the military. So I'm curious, how did training change each of you? You each described kind of your life before the service. When you go through training, how did you come out differently? And so Joanna, I'll start with you because we all know the Marines has the most significant, training, I would think.
Definitely. I think we had the longest training, and we call it recruit training, even not boot camp, because the Marine Corps likes to be, extra different. I would say that I probably had a very unique indoctrination experience because of how I was raised. So I have an immigrant parent. My mother is from Korea. And so her style of discipline my whole life prepared me for the Marine Corps, definitely. And then my dad, of course, having served in the Air Force and being a very regimented type of person, and he had served, starting in the 60s and went to Vietnam twice. So he had a very much different experience, even than those in garrison. So for me, going to training, the mental part and the aggression was okay for me. But what really changed me was the discipline, and then opening up and understanding what a real team mentality is. Having played organized sports, I had always been a part of teams, but the teams that you have are very far different. You have a far different goal, and your cohesion means everything, your survival even. And so that I think I thrived from a lot, coming from my childhood, seeming isolated or having a traumatic growing up experience versus my peers because of the cultural dynamics in my home. But it did very much change me. It also really reinforced a lot of the feminist ideology I had already had about what women could in fact do. And so I left boot camp extremely empowered and ready to take on the world.
All right, Signa, how about you?
Well, I was the youngest of five, and I was the very youngest of five. I was the oops kid, and I was very spoiled, came from a different background where I was spoiled and sheltered. And my entry into boot camp, I started at Fort Jackson, and we ended up in Fort Gordon, Georgia. And I was in shock at first, but I was always taught to be, try to be strong, even though I was pampered. And I went from this pampered little spoiled girl to a squad leader. We had, and this was basic training as an enlisted person, we had 4 companies, and one was a female only company at the time because it was in the 80s. And I became one of the leaders, one of the squad leaders. I was able to, pull on some inner strength that I had no idea that I had before. And to JoJo's point, I came out very empowered, very strong, very certain of everything I wanted to do and who I wanted to be. And the officer training was impactful as well because it was very different from the enlisted training. First and foremost, the different level of, respect that you get as an officer just because, you have a bar or a couple of bars on your collar was different. But it gave me a different perspective about the people I served with earlier and gave me a big respect in that officer training for the people I would be working with and commanding, which were the NCOs and enlisted people.
All right, thank you, Signa. And how about Jessica?
So very similar to both Signa and Joanna, it's the empowerment and really getting to the bottom of what I am made out of was really something that I learned about myself while I was in basic training. And I had the unique opportunity, kind of like what Signa's saying. I went in as an 18-year-old, served for 8 years, had a 15-year break in service, and then went back into the military at the age of 42 and went back to basic training again for the new job that I was being trained for. So when I went in the second time, now having 4 children and lived, a whole life, and going back into basic training, getting yelled at all over again, what I noticed differently was, number one, that I already knew what I was made out of. So the fear of what was going to happen was completely taken away from me. Not that it made it easier, and not that you ever get used to being yelled at. However, I knew what we were working towards. And so because of that, I really embraced the second experience. And I think it also helped that we were all having to wear masks. And so I could hide a lot of my giggling of some of just the absurdness of being yelled at by someone half my age. However, I learned so much in that second experience, and what we learn about ourselves, it stays with us. And so even though I certainly wasn't the fastest one in my class at the age of 42, I held my own and did what needed to get done because I knew I was made of that. Quitting wasn't an option. I had 3 teenage daughters watching my every move. You think I was going to come back home, not succeeding at what I was sent to do. So that was really what I think changed most about me, was just the mindset that's carried me to the rest of my life.
Yeah.
No,
So I want to follow up. Yeah, sorry, Scott, let me just jump in. I want to follow up with each of you real quickly on this, because you each sort of talked about, I think even Joanna, you said this very like you came out of it more of a feminist, like your feminist ideology was brought forth. You found your own powers within yourselves. I wonder, like, if you can expand on that and just tell us about why. It seems odd because you're in this institution that, especially at the time, was not equal at all. Did you feel that, or did you feel like you could earn your place in it? Like, how did you come to a place where you felt more in touch with your feminism?
I think for the Marine Corps, when I joined, it was a little bit different experience, maybe even for Signa and Jessica, in that just until last year, the Marine Corps kept women and men completely separated in that training cycle. Like you don't see each other. And so my experience going to Parris Island which is where they only trained women Marines at the time, at 4th Battalion, where my entire leadership and chain of command were female hats, except for when I went to a classroom, I might have a male drill instructor in there. But generally, it was this all woman environment. And so to see women on all different levels, at all different shapes, sizes, backgrounds, experiences, and just capabilities, and being able to watch that succinct growth in all of us from day one to that last day. And having grown up in the era that I grew up, where it was like, girls can never do what boys can do. Or if you do, then maybe you're just a little bit more exceptional. Or you can play girls sports, but then we'll organize you over here. And so everything was very separate. And the messages I always got growing up was that girls were just a little bit less than guys. And leaving boot camp, and I knew that to not be true, right? I was racing boys, I was beating them at sports, and I was like, I'm not the only one. And so graduating from boot camp and being around that many women and idolizing the women that trained me, and not having seen that anywhere in my life before, where women had such power, such prestige, and honor in what they were doing. And it just solidified like those dreams that I had, that what I knew to be true is that women are, this powerful force. And if, we had the same opportunity, we might be further along than we really truly are. And so leaving that experience, I really did feel that through and through it, and tried to carry that on throughout my career as things changed, as I integrated, of course, and I got different messages. But in those moments, you couldn't tell me anything. I remember walking around on boot leave for 10 days straight with like tank tops, because I wanted everybody to see my muscles, and see what I had become. And then to tell a man or, anybody that I was a Marine, it just gave me a lot of power.
I want to toss this to Scott, because you also served in the military, but in a obviously from a different perspective. What was it like? What were your perceptions, experiences of serving with women before everything sort of changed when Obama changed things and allowed women into combat units, et cetera?
Well, again, I'll say, the military was probably 85, 90% men, even when I was in the late 2000s, 2009 to 2014. And I remember distinctly going to the rifle range one day to qualify. And I struggled, I'd never really shot a rifle before. And I shot the minimum score to pass. And nobody really gave me a hard time. But I know that if a woman shot the minimum score to pass, she would probably get a pretty hard time about that. There are also, stories about, if a man got hurt right before deployment, very few people would say, oh, he's just getting hurt to get out of deployment. But if a woman got pregnant, even 8 months before a deployment, there would be the whole, oh, she just got pregnant to get out of deployment. So, I'm curious, what was it like for you all being in that hypermasculine environment where, you probably had to work harder to prove yourself? And, Signa, speaking to you, I think I remember you having a specific story about going to qualify at the rifle range.
Yeah, I had several different experiences, but I am competitive to the nth degree. So in basic, I wouldn't run with the women's company. I ran with the men. And I even passed out one time because I overheated and woke up with my drill sergeant in my face, telling me not to run with the men. And the next time we ran, I ran with the men again because I wasn't going to be defeated. What Scott's referring to is I shoot expert. I'm an ex-cop. I was in the military before, so I was very familiar by the time I got to Fort Benning, the home of the infantry, HUA, if you can imagine that. And I go out to the range, and there's a lot of sergeant majors and command sergeant majors out there, and I'm a female and a JAG officer. You could imagine what they thought about me. They're like, oh, this is going to be comedy central. So, the range master comes out and he hands me the weapon and he's like, so there's going to be some targets pop up and you should try to knock them down as they pop up. And I'm thinking, okay. And so I've got a crowd behind me. I have a whole audience behind me because they're going to get the big ever gotten watching this female JAG officer try to knock these targets down. So the whistle goes off. I've got my ear protection, my eye protection on, and I am laying those targets down as they pop up. And, there's complete silence, and I even, when he handed me the weapon, I was like, should I hold it like this? If you're going to treat me like a woman, let's play the game. And I felt like a pool shark, pulling somebody in because it's like, this dude is really out of his league. And so when it was over, he comes up and I take my ear protection off and he goes, ma'am, you're a ringer. And I was like, never assume, Sergeant, never assume. So I walked back through the whole gang of sergeant majors and command sergeant majors. And one asked me, he said, ma'am, are you married? And I said, no. He said, because I was going to tell him, don't mess with her, dead on. And so it was fun. It was great. And, those were the challenges. I had to score to Scott's statements. I had to score 100% on everything, especially at the home of the infantry. I was an officer and I was a female and I was a JAG officer. So I literally would starve myself so I didn't have to be taped because I'm an officer. And I'd make 100% on the run, on the push-ups, on the sit-ups, because I had to have that standard. So that's my story.
So there was a question in the chat. Basically, the message that women got in the military was they had to be twice as good to be considered equal. And Jessica and Joanna, I'm curious if you experienced that. You have to be twice as good as a man to be considered equal. Jessica, we'll start with you. Did you experience anything like that when you were?
Well, for me, I definitely noticed that. And because I was not the strongest and not the fastest, what I had to really find out really quickly during my training is how I could use the gifts that I did have to rise up in leadership. And so for me, because I'm not competitive, because I'm not, have that urge to like win all the time, what I had to find out was how can I still be impactful and what we call a force magnifier with the gifts that I do have. And so for me, I recognized really quickly that I did have a really strong mindset. And so that was really helpful for me in encouraging other people to not get discouraged when they felt like, especially the females, like when they felt like they weren't getting the recognition or they felt like they weren't going to make it. And then the second part that I really recognized that I was really good at was building community and like encouraging community within our platoon. And through those things is how I was able to kind of be in leadership without necessarily being the fastest or the quickest. And I was an all right shot, even at the rifle range. But in my new job that I'm in now in the Arizona National Guard, we're non-combatant, so we don't carry weapons. So I'm really glad that I don't have to worry about qualifying on an M16 anymore.
Joanna, what about you? I know the Marine Corps is probably the most competitive and the most, masculine. So did you experience kind of the same?
Definitely. I remember specifically PFT time. And so
real quick, the PFT is the physical fitness test for those of you.
Yeah. And so when you're getting ready to go out there, it's like your company or your whole squadron or, whoever has to go out and qualify, you're set up so you can hear everybody talking. And most people are like kind of pointing out people and wagering, who's going to come in last, who's going to have to get on a vehicle. And so having heard that, all the time in the background and seeing people be, it makes you, definitely never want to put yourself in that place. And so it made me probably overtrain a lot, not eat very well, and take think like I had I had my two sons while serving. And so knowing that I was pregnant and already stigmatized and wanting to come out of pregnancy at the gate 100%, there were a lot of unhealthy practices that I partook in, like taking RIP fuel or things of that nature, postpartum, just to compete. And so that definitely was a thing. Like you had to be above average if you were a woman Marine, or you were going to be talked about incessantly. And I never understood that because in the Marine Corps, there's far more men than there are women. Like it's even grossly more exaggerated in our branch of service being the smallest. And so there are a lot of men who don't, who are all the way down on the third tier. And nobody talks about them in that way at all. But if you're a woman, you're going to be talked about, even if you pass, but and then it's even worse if something's wrong with you, like some of the other ladies had expressed, like if you get sick or you have a sprained ankle. I know women who graduated boot camp on 2 broken ankles because they refused to tell people that. And so, yeah, it was very much competitive. And the same with in the Marine Corps, they send you to a lot of different schools. And so there's like the top female and then the top male of the class. And so, all the women are vying to be that top female, which could also make it a very stressful environment. So the competition was very serious, and how they categorize women in the Marine Corps was vicious. And so you didn't want to be in any category that wasn't in the top tier.
So I want to then ask you each, this is a little bit of a speculative question, but I think it might say a lot. I mean, things have changed, right? Like opportunities for women have expanded greatly in the military. They can now serve in nearly, every job, every unit. It's not like it was probably when you were all there. If you could go back in today, would you? Would you do that? And would you hope it would be more equal, a little less of these, sort of challenges that you feel like you face just because you were women? Let's start with you, Signa.
Well, that's a great assumption that you can do different jobs, and you can, but I don't know that it's changed so dramatically for women. The thought process, I don't, that's not what I'm hearing from people that are in. It's kind of the same thing still happening, even though more opportunities are open to you. It's still, to some degree, not as severe, I guess, as when I was in there, but to some degree, it is, still some of those same, because it's society. It's a microcosm of society. So, until we reach that plane where people are just seen as human and just people, we won't get there. But would I do it again now? And I'm not this age. Yes, I would absolutely do it again. It was a good time. I reflect on it, even with the challenges, because life is a challenge. Even with the challenges, I reflect on it and I think good thoughts.
Let's go to then Jessica next, and we'll end with Joanna on this one.
So I actually did go back into the military after a 15-year break in service, as I mentioned earlier. And there was a few reasons for me going back in. I felt deeply called. So I'm in the chaplain candidate program with the Army, the Arizona National Guard. And one of the reasons I felt called to go back into the military had to do with the lack of chaplain representation for women. One of my battle buddies while I was in service was raped, and it has just deeply impacted my work in the community with women and men who've experienced military sexual trauma. And one of the things that she said to me that has stayed with me was that she didn't reach out to anybody because she couldn't find a female chaplain. And so that was one of the things that was a motivating factor for me to go in, as well as also wanting to be a part of the culture that's changing military sexual trauma. And since I have left the service the first time when I was in, there has been an increase in programs and support and change in protocol to address these types of situations. And here in Arizona, specifically, our highest ranking Arizona National Guard, two-star General Carrie Mullenbeck, she's a Major General Carrie Mullenbeck, is a female. And so for me, I am seeing in what I'm doing right now, I'm seeing great hope for female leadership. And when I'm at drill weekends, we have a command sergeant major in my unit, female. And so I'm seeing a lot of high-ranking women around me, which encourages and inspires me. So much so that when my 17-year-old daughter came to me and said she wanted to join the military, I felt hopeful that the military that she was stepping into, although we know it's not perfect, and of course, just like any organization has a lot of work to do, I felt good that I was able to tell my daughter, yes, honey, I think this is a great decision that you're making. And she has joined the Air National Guard, and she leaves for basic training on Tuesday.
That is a great segue. I want to go to Joanna on this question next, and then I'm going to ask you another question on that, Jessica. So Joanna, first, answer that last question for us about whether you would go back in today.
Yeah, I think even with all my traumatic experiences in the service, it was such a pivotal time in my life that I would never want to erase it, and I would definitely do it again if I had the chance. if I had the chance to do it again and being smarter about it, like Jessica has. And I'll tell you, I've been friends with Jess for many years. And when I saw the announcement that she was doing it, it just tickled me because I know her, and I know like that motivation under there was like, oh my God, this girl is going back and she's going to change some shit, like. And that's what I love about the women that I've served with, is that we don't forget where we come from. We work really hard to make the changes and strides. And I'm so proud that her daughter is joining this service. And I even feel confident that, we're more aware as a society. And even though those problems still exist, and I'll tell you, it made me nervous if my daughter ever asked me back when she was growing up, and thankfully she never did. But I think it was probably because I was too open with her about my traumas that I sustained. And also the world has been topsy-turvy since they've grown up. But it does bring me hope. And I have a lot of women that I mentor that are still serving because I want to stay connected to that community. And I want to make sure that it's getting better. And they're reporting back, like they see us veteran women in advocacy. And so now they advocate for themselves in service. And so I've seen great strides specifically for women in the Marine Corps as it relates to weight standards that have grossly, debilitated women's lives post-service because of the standards that they're held to, especially women of color that come from different cultural environments. And the things that they've had to sustain based on that kind of body morphia that you get in the military. And even that's changing. Like they have focus groups, they're bringing women in to make those changes, not bringing a bunch of men in to talk about us, so I am hopeful. But like Justin Signa said, we are a sector, we are a small visual of what's happening across the world, we're that example. And so all the things that we need to fix in the service are all the still things that we need to fix, in our nation. And so as we get better, it will only get better. And I'm hopeful that it will.
I appreciate all of your optimism. I want to end with a final question, and then we'll turn to a few audience questions. So two of you have now said you would, it sounds like, have different answers to your daughters if they asked you whether they wanted to go in today. What do each of you think still needs to change? What would you like to advocate for? And I mean, Jessica, you mentioned, sexual trauma. Joanna, you mentioned, women of color being in a specific position. I mean, what are some of the issues that you think still need to be addressed? Do you want to begin there, Signa?
Sure. The same things that are in society, I think, need to be addressed, just realizing that everybody is human and treating everybody as human beings. Jessica, hats off to you. One of my favorite people at Fort Benning was a female chaplain, and she was an amazing person, which I'm sure you are. But, just having the look-see when there are issues, because just as in society, in the military, you're that smaller sector of society, and you still do see those, issues of, sexual abuse and that sort of thing. They have to take those things seriously, and that has to be, fully investigated. And women need to know that they can report those things and be heard and be given to them. I did prosecute a military service member for raping another service member's child, and he was let off. And I'm sure, hopefully, that's not the case anymore. But one of the panelists, because that was the only one I lost, they put him out for something else. They would not convict him. And even the defense attorney came and said, you beat me all over that courtroom. But one of the panelists came to my office afterwards, and it was a high-ranking NCO, and he said, "Ma'am, we're going to put him out. We just wouldn't convict him." And that just tore me apart. That you knew he was guilty of the crime, that we charged him with and we proved, but you're going to release him on society so he can further violate women. I hope that's got to change, and I hope it does change. But that was the situation while I was in it, and that was a pivotal moment that made me get out, because I'd lost honor there.
Wow. Let me turn to you, Joanna, next, and we'll end with Jessica on this one.
Can you restate the question again?
Wondering what it is that you think still needs to change going forward.
I think some of the things that they're doing as far as the integration piece is big. So keeping women and men separate, and then forcing them to have to work together when we're in these forever wars was not a good, idea to begin with. And in an all volunteer force, and knowing that women are capable physically and mentally to do any job in the military, I think that will fast track a lot of change. Because what was happening before is that they were like, okay, we're going to flood women into the service, but then they can only get these types of roles. And so then you're still looked at as kind of like a subset, not really fully integrated. So now that we're flooding into the combat roles, now that we have full opportunity to participate in all these different units, I think as that grows and the population of women grow to serve, it will only improve. But that also means that those women have to have the same opportunity to excel and be put in leadership positions. I served from 1998 until 2007, and I never had a woman leader over me, never. They were either my peers or one rank below me or above me, as we were both working our ways up. But I never had a woman that I could turn to. And a lot of the trauma that I had, I really could have used women leadership. And I think that's something that the military should focus on, and where they place people, and ensuring that there's representation for your entire unit at your unit and not isolated. And then another example of that is when I came back from the war in Iraq, if you're going to sustain a career, you take a B billet, and I was put on recruiting duty. And then again, I was sent to a state off, kind of post command, away from like the military industrial complex. And I was one woman in a unit of 60 recruiting men who had all come from infantry units who were not really supervised. And so it was a very scary time for me. Just in that setting. And so there are a lot of spaces that we don't think about in the military that are not just, getting ready to deploy and go to war, that we need to ensure that there's representation and somebody, an ally, everywhere that you are. And then obviously the legislation and the protocol that takes what crimes do happen in the military out of the hands of commanders. That to me just doesn't make any sense, because we already know there's a lot of nepotism and things that are happening in the United States military that doesn't, fare well when it comes for adjudication processes. And so those are issues that are still being fought through legislation. But I think that's why we need to share more of our veteran stories with the American populace, because I think they just hear about the military and veterans and kind of the hero arc, and they're just told, thank you for your service and honor us. But we have real problems, and problems that they could help us fix faster if they're engaged with what needs to be happen legislatively for our lives to improve in the service.
Really interesting. All right, and Jessica, final word on this one, and then we'll turn to Scott with a few audience questions.
Well, I think Joanna and Signa basically covered everything that I would say regarding representation. And as Joanna was speaking about the legislation that changes the protocol for crimes that happen and taking it out of the chain of command. I just remember in Iraq, it was an all-male command staff while we were there. And, it was a difficult deployment. And I think that having a female represented in our leadership, I think would have been important in some of the challenges that occurred while we were deployed. It's a miserable deployment to begin with, especially when I was there back in 2003 when things had first started. And so just representation, and as I mentioned earlier, I currently am seeing great representation of women in high-ranking leadership roles. And my daughter, she chose a job as a hydraulic systems maintenance for aircraft, and in her shop, a lot of men, and she's going to be surrounded probably by a lot of men, maybe because women may not necessarily care for that field. I don't know what it might be, but she's absolutely interested in it. And so I hope that by her going into this shop and sharing with her friends what she's doing, and her bigger dream of being a pilot, and this being a pathway for her, I hope that her story, and even my story as Hispanic women in the military, I do try to share on social media what I'm doing, mostly because we have to see it. And if we don't see it, we don't know what's possible. And so as I have young nieces and nephews and godchildren, that are watching what I'm doing, I want them to see what's possible.
Yes, I will have to leave it there. We're about out of time here. I could keep going, and I'm sure Scott has more questions for you. And we didn't get to every audience question. What a wonderful discussion. So much I appreciate about all of your perspectives and your stories. Thank you so much for sharing and for doing this with us. Thank you to Scott for producing the podcast, and of course for lending your perspective and expertise today. And thank you to all of you for joining us. Thank you for being a wonderful audience, and hopefully we'll be able to do these things in person again one day, but nice to have you all here. Thank you again.
Here, Arizona is a production of the Division of Public Service at Rio Salado College, which includes Sun Sounds of Arizona, Spot 127, KBOC, and KJZZ. This podcast series is made possible by a grant from the Nina Mason Pulliam Charitable Trust and support from listeners like you. Thank you. This episode was produced, written, directed, and hosted by Scott Bourque. Linda Pastore is our executive producer. Thanks for listening.